Nobody said, "Hey, by the way, you are going to be the only human on an alien space station with 400 different species, and every single one of them is going to stare at you like you just crawled out of a burning building holding a baby." Nobody mentioned that part. They gave me a briefing packet, 47 pages, single-spaced, about galactic diplomatic protocol, atmospheric composition requirements, translation matrix etiquette, and which alien species considered direct eye contact a declaration of war. 47 pages. And not one sentence about what it actually feels like to walk into a pressurized transit hub, the size of a small moon, and realize you are the only thing in there with 2 legs, soft skin, forward-facing eyes, and the vague smell of wet soil and iron that apparently, according to 12 different species, screams predator from a death world before you even open your mouth. That first morning, or what passed for morning, since the station ran on a 26-hour cycle synced to some planetary body I'd never heard of, I walked out of my assigned quarters, which were a modified atmospheric pod on Ring 7, and I just stood there in the corridor for probably a full 60 seconds. The corridor was enormous, wide enough to fit 3 city buses side by side. The ceiling was curved and high and pulsed with soft bioluminescent lighting, cycling through colors I didn't have names for, not quite blue, not quite violet, something that sat between ultraviolet and indigo that my eyes couldn't fully register. The floor was a kind of smooth composite that made almost no sound when you walked on it, which was both eerie and oddly peaceful. And down that corridor, moving in both directions with the quiet efficiency of a transit system that had been running for centuries, were aliens. I know that sounds obvious. I knew I was going to an alien space station. I had seen images in the briefing. I had attended 3 VR orientation sessions at the embassy. I thought I was prepared. I was not prepared. There was a species, I later learned they were called the Velkari, that stood about 9 feet tall, with elongated bodies and 4 arms that moved independently, each one doing a different task at the same time. They wore loose garments that shifted color with their mood, and when they walked, they moved with this slow, deliberate grace that made you feel like you were watching deep ocean footage in slow motion. There were at least 6 of them in my immediate line of sight. There was another species, the Drathan, that moved in small, tight clusters, their bodies low to the ground, quadrupedal but with upright torsos that split at the shoulder into 2 separate upper bodies sharing a lower half. They communicated in a series of rapid clicking sounds, and the occasional burst of what my translation matrix identified as subsonic emotional broadcast, which basically meant they could make you feel vague emotions, not thoughts, just feelings, if you were standing within about 3 meters. I didn't know that at first. The first time I walked past a cluster of Drathan, I felt this sudden, inexplicable wave of nostalgia, the kind you get when you smell something from your childhood, and I stopped and looked around, confused, and a small Drathan at the edge of the cluster turned to look at me, and something in her posture shifted. Later, my station liaison told me that what I'd experienced was a bleed effect from their group communication. Apparently the nostalgia wasn't theirs, it was mine. They'd somehow pulled a surface emotion and reflected it. She said it happened sometimes with new arrivals, but the intensity of the reflection with me had surprised them. They were not expecting your surface emotions to be so vivid, my liaison told me. My liaison was a Velkari named Thesivor. She was one of the 9-foot ones. She had chosen a humanoid-adjacent configuration for her garments and posture. She'd researched human interaction patterns and adjusted her physical approach accordingly, which I found both deeply professional and slightly unsettling, in that touching way when you realize someone has gone out of their way to make you comfortable. She stood at about 7.5 feet rather than her full 9, because she'd read that humans found extreme height differentials disorienting in casual conversation. I found out about that later too. She never mentioned it, she just did it. Vivid, I repeated, that first morning in the corridor. Is that a problem? No, Thesivor said. She had this way of tilting her head that was oddly bird-like, a slow rotation that gave her a longer look at something. It is simply unusual. Most species we host here have learned to modulate their surface emotional signature. Humans have not yet been here long enough to learn that. We've been here 2 days. Yes, she said, and there was something in her translated voice, a quality my matrix rendered as gentle amusement, that made me feel like I was a child who had just pointed out that the sky was blue. I would later understand, something of an event. The Velhydrus orbital hub had been in operation for approximately 430 galactic standard years. In that time, tens of thousands of species had passed through it. Diplomats, traders, refugees, explorers, scientists, pilgrims heading to spiritual sites in the outer rim, all of them had moved through these corridors. The station had seen everything. It had seen wars narrowly avoided in its conference suites. It had seen the signing of 7 major galactic treaties. It had seen disease quarantines, black market busts, at least 3 attempted coups that had been quietly resolved before they became public knowledge. Humans had been cleared for access to galactic space about 8 years ago, Earth time. The process had been, well, it had been complicated. A lot of the galactic community had been watching Earth for several centuries, and the general opinion was apparently something like impressive but terrifying, which I'll get to. 8 years of access, and in that entire time, exactly 4 humans had ever set foot on Velhydrus. The first 2 were survey delegation members who had passed through for less than 36 hours each. The third was a researcher who had stayed for 11 days, conducting atmospheric studies. The fourth was me. I was assigned a 6-month residency as part of a cultural exchange program that was, frankly, still in its experimental phase. Nobody was entirely sure what I was supposed to do beyond be there and not cause any diplomatic incidents. I had a secondary role as an observer for the Human Galactic Affairs Office, which meant I submitted written reports on my experiences. But mostly in those first days I was just there, existing, walking around, being the only human. And within about 48 hours of my arrival, I was aware that I had become something of an attraction. Not in a malicious way, not even in a fully conscious way at first. It was subtler than that. I would walk into one of the common areas. There were dozens of these, designed to accommodate dozens of different atmospheric preferences, gravity settings, and social configurations. And I would notice, gradually, the way attention shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but heads would turn. Sensory organs, eyes, sonar receptors, bioluminescent feelers would orient in my direction. Conversations would pause just slightly, for just a beat too long to be coincidental. I mentioned it to Thesivor on my 3rd day. Is it the human smell thing? I asked. The briefing said some species find our biochemistry alarming. Some do, she said, but that is not primarily what you are experiencing. What am I experiencing then? She tilted her head, that slow, thoughtful rotation. You are experiencing curiosity, she said. Genuine, sustained curiosity, which is unusual. Why unusual? Because this station has seen most things, she said. Very few things are genuinely new here. You are genuinely new. I sat with that for a moment. That's either really flattering or kind of terrifying, I said. Possibly both, Thesivor said. And that was the first time I heard what I was fairly certain was actual laughter in her translated voice. The thing about being the only representative of your entire species in a place is that you stop being yourself, at least partially. You become a kind of ambassador whether you want to be or not. Every choice I made, what I ate, how I moved, whether I held eye contact, how I reacted to something unexpected, felt like it was being filed away somewhere, cataloged, added to some enormous data set titled Humans, Preliminary Field Observations. I tried not to think about that too hard, Mostly I failed. What I could not have predicted, and what the briefing most definitely did not cover, was that the curiosity was not evenly distributed. Male members of the various species on the station seemed to regard me with a mix of cautious interest and watchful assessment. Some of it was political. I was from Earth, after all, and Earth had a reputation. Some of it was biological. The briefing had been right that certain species found human biochemistry unsettling, a kind of subliminal alarm bell that registered apex predator before any conscious thought kicked in. And some of it was simply the natural wariness you apply to something you don't fully understand yet. The female members of the various species, and I use female loosely, because galactic biology is a topic that requires its own multi-volume series, were different. They were curious in a way that was more direct, more intentional. I first really noticed it on day 4. I was in the station's main transit hub, the central ring that connected all 7 outer rings, eating what my food processor had generated based on my nutritional profile. It wasn't bad, actually. The station's dietary accommodation systems were sophisticated enough to produce something that tasted roughly like a grain bowl with roasted vegetables, which was not something I'd expected. I'd brought protein bars as backup. I ended up not needing them. I was eating and reading through my morning observation notes. I kept a handwritten journal, actual paper and pen, which I'd brought from Earth, and this alone had apparently generated significant discussion among station staff, when I became aware that someone was standing near my table. I looked up. She was Velkari, like Thesavor, but younger in Velkari terms, which I still didn't fully understand. Smaller, too, closer to 7 feet. Her garment was shifting through a rapid sequence of colors that my matrix identified as excitement, curiosity, uncertainty, cycling through them too fast for her to be fully in control of it, which meant the emotion was genuine. The garments were mood reactive, and the really experienced Velkari had learned to modulate them the way a skilled human learns to control their facial expressions. Young ones hadn't mastered it yet. The rapid cycling meant she was feeling exactly what it looked like she was feeling. She was holding something, a small recording device, flat and oval about the size of my palm, and she was looking at it, then at me, then at it again. "Do you need something?" I asked. She startled, which was remarkable because she was at least twice my size and probably could have picked me up with one hand. She actually flinched backward. Her translation matrix took a moment. First generation unit, I guessed there was a slight delay. "I apologize for the intrusion. I did not mean to disturb your meal period. She stopped, steadied herself. "My designation is Vale. I'm a 3rd cycle student in xenobiological studies. I wondered if I might ask you some questions about humans for my research, but only if it is acceptable. I understand if it is not." She said all of this in one continuous rush, and then stood very still, her garment having settled on a steady amber-orange that my matrix labeled as apprehensive hope. I set down my fork. "Pull up a chair," I said, "or whatever works for you." Her garment shifted immediately to something between gold and rose, something my matrix took a moment to categorize, and then rendered as relieved delight. She sat. The seat across from me was too small for her. She perched on it at an angle, her long limbs arranged carefully, like she was very aware of taking up too much space in a situation where she wanted to make a good impression. It was, I realized, a posture I recognized. It was the posture of someone who is desperately trying to be less intimidating than they naturally are. I felt immediately at ease. "What do you want to know?" I said. "Everything," she said, and then caught herself. "That is, I have specific questions prepared. I have been preparing them for 3 days since I learned you were arriving. But in this moment, in proximity to you, the honest answer is everything." I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was such a human answer, the gap between the prepared version and the honest version. She tilted her head at the sound, not startled this time, fascinated. "That sound," she said, "that is laughter. You are laughing." "Yeah," I said. "It is." She paused. "The recordings did not fully capture it, the quality of it. In person it is." She seemed to search for a word. "Contagious is the translation my matrix offers, but I believe the meaning is slightly different than the word implies. It creates a resonant response. I feel an urge to produce a similar sound." "That's pretty much what contagious means in this context," I told her. Her garment shifted to something warm and layered, pleased. "Then I have understood it correctly," she said. The questions Vale asked me over the next 2 hours were remarkable, not because they were profound, necessarily, but because of what they revealed about what the galactic community thought they knew about humans, and the gap between that and reality. She asked me if it was true that humans slept in specific architectural structures, separated from one another by physical barriers, rather than in communal warmth clusters. I told her yes, mostly in beds, in bedrooms with walls and doors. She found this extraordinary. On the audio recording she was keeping, she noted, humans practice a form of deliberate isolation during rest cycles. This appears to be culturally normative rather than a response to threat. Reason unclear, possibly linked to individual identity formation patterns. She asked me if humans really had only a single range of emotional expression, meaning only one face, only one set of expressions, no secondary chromatic or bioluminescent layer to supplement communication. I told her yes, just the one face. She noted, humans rely almost entirely on a single expressive surface and are therefore highly dependent on verbal communication for nuance. They have compensated by developing extraordinarily complex language systems with extensive tonal variation. Cross-reference emotional layering study. She asked me if it was true that humans ate multiple times per day, every day, without exception, and that skipping these meal periods caused significant physical and psychological distress. I confirmed this, 3 times a day minimum. She noted, human metabolic requirements are constant and high maintenance relative to body mass. This may be connected to the elevated body temperature, rapid healing observations, and reports of sustained physical output under extreme conditions. They may be running a biological system operating at a much higher baseline than most observed species. High maintenance, high performance. File under Death World Biology subheading. That last part caught my attention. Death World, I repeated. She looked up from her recording device. Her garments cycled slightly, the amber-orange of apprehension flickering at the edges. "I apologize," she said. "It is academic terminology. I did not intend to use a value-loaded term." "No, it's fine," I said. "I've heard it. Earth gets categorized as a death world in a lot of galactic literature. I'm just curious about the specifics." She seemed to consider whether to proceed. Then she made a decision. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, something releasing in her upper frame. "The classification is based on several factors," she said carefully. "Your planet's gravity is significantly higher than average habitable world gravity, which means your biology has developed under conditions that require greater muscular and skeletal density than most species we interact with. Your planet's atmospheric chemistry is volatile, high oxygen concentration, which your biology uses extremely efficiently, but which is genuinely hazardous to several galactic species. Your planet's ecology is," she paused, "competitive. In ways that most galactic ecologies are not. Most inhabited worlds achieved ecological stability through gradual balance. Earth's ecology remained in active, ongoing competition for most of its biological history. You evolved in that competition, as part of it." "We were prey before we were predators," I said. "You were never simply prey," she said. The records suggest you occupied multiple positions in the food chain simultaneously from relatively early in your species development. The capacity to be both, to understand both, is unusual. Most species have a cleaner evolutionary narrative. I thought about that for a moment. What does that look like to the galactic community, I asked, when they look at humans? Vale's garment cycled slowly through several colors before settling. It looks, she said carefully, like someone opened a door they weren't sure should be opened, and what came through was not what they expected. They expected something simple, something that fit a category. Instead they got, she tilted her head, something that doesn't fit any category cleanly. Something that laughs, something that writes on paper, something that feels nostalgia so vividly that a Drathan cluster can taste it from across a corridor. Something that heals faster than it should and runs hotter than it should and persists longer than it should. She looked at me directly. Her primary visual organs were large and dark and deep, with a slight iridescence at the edge that caught the light differently when she moved. Something the galactic community is not sure whether to be fascinated by or afraid of, she said, and has not yet determined that these are mutually exclusive. Silence. That's a lot, I said finally. Yes, she said, and something in her translated voice carried what I could only interpret as a kind of respect. I imagine it is. After Vale left, she had a class, apparently. Even on alien space stations, there were schedules to keep. I sat in the common area for a while longer and thought about what she'd said. The galactic community, 400 and some years of coordinated space travel and trade and diplomacy across thousands of species. And humans, who had been out here for 8 years, had already become, what? A curiosity, a mystery, a data point that didn't fit cleanly into any existing model. I wondered, sitting there with my cooling grain bowl and my paper journal, whether that was frightening or freeing. I decided it was both. I wrote that down. Then I wrote, the Drathan tasted my nostalgia today. I need to figure out how to get better at containing my emotional output, or this is going to be a very long 6 months. Then immediately below that, no, actually, let them taste it. If the only information most of these species have about humans is second-hand reports and academic papers, maybe the most useful thing I can do is just feel things openly and let them observe. I underlined that second entry. It would turn out to be the most important decision I made in my first week on Velhydrus. Thesivor found me later that afternoon. She moved through the common area with that slow, oceanic grace that I'd started to think of as distinctly Velkari. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted, every motion deliberate. She lowered herself into a position adjacent to my table and looked at me with that characteristic head tilt. You were visited by Vale of the research cohort, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, nice kid. Is she actually a student here? She is, Thesivor confirmed. Third cycle xenobiology. Her primary research focus is on newly contacted species and their integration patterns. She submitted a request to be part of your orientation committee when your assignment was announced. Was she approved? She was not. Her cohort level was insufficient. She has apparently been waiting in the common area near your quarters for 3 mornings in case you emerged early. I looked at Thesivor. She staked out my pod, I said. That is one way to characterize it, Thesivor said, with the carefully neutral tone of someone who was trying very hard not to endorse behavior while also not quite condemning it. How long has she been doing that? Since your second day. I thought about that. I'm kind of touched, honestly. That is, Thesivor tilted her head the other direction. A human response I was not anticipating. What were you anticipating? Discomfort, concern about privacy, a formal request for perimeter protocols. Should I be concerned about privacy? Is this a problem? Does she mean any harm? Categorically not, Thesivor said. Vale is simply, she is someone for whom curiosity functions like gravity. It pulls her toward things she wants to understand. You are the most interesting thing she has ever encountered. She is not sure what to do with that other than study it. I understood that feeling. I had the same relationship with old abandoned buildings and cold cases and books that started with strange first lines. Tell her she can come by and ask questions when she wants, I said. I don't mind. Thesivor looked at me for a long moment. I will relay that, she said. I should also inform you Vale is not the only one. Not the only what? Not the only member of this station who has been arranging proximity with you, waiting for the right moment to make contact. I set down my pen. How many are we talking about? Thesivor consulted something on a small display. Current count, she said, is 47, with indications that this number may grow. 47. 47 different people are staking out my pod. Not all are physically surveilling your quarters, she said, with precision. Several are working through alternative channels. There have been 12 formal requests submitted through the station's interspecies liaison office for scheduled meetings with you. There are also 7 individuals who have simply been timing their corridor transits to coincide with your observation schedule. I stared at her. My observation schedule, I repeated. You mean my walks? Yes. They know my walking route. Velhadris is a sophisticated station, Thesivor said carefully. Its internal positioning systems are thorough. Someone is tracking my walks and distributing that information. I would not characterize it as distribution exactly. It is more that the information became available, and several individuals found it useful. I took a slow breath, looked at the ceiling, watched the bioluminescent light cycle through that not quite violet color. Is this a safety concern? I asked. No, Thesivor said, immediately and firmly. These are not individuals who mean you any harm. I have reviewed all 47. They are researchers, students, cultural specialists, diplomatic attaches, one civilian merchant who has apparently encountered human-made goods and developed a significant interest in their production culture. And she paused. 3 members of the station's security cohort who are attending to their interest on personal time. The security team is personally interested in me. You are the most unusual thing to arrive at this station in approximately 40 years, Thesivor said. The last thing that generated comparable interest was the first MHAC delegation, and they were 17 individuals traveling together. I'm generating more curiosity than 17 aliens. You are generating curiosity of a different quality, she corrected. The MHAC were unusual because they were diplomatically controversial. You are unusual because no one is sure what to do with you. She tilted her head. In the best possible sense, most of the interest is warm. I want to be precise about that. The quality of attention directed at you is warm. I looked at her. You're telling me 47 aliens are interested in me? Yes. And you want me to know this? I want you to know this so that you can make informed decisions about how you spend your time, she said, and so that you do not experience the next several weeks feeling as though strange things are happening around you without understanding why. I thought about that first wave of nostalgia by the Drathan cluster, about Vale waiting outside my pod for 3 mornings, about the corridor attention that shifted whenever I walked through. That ship might have already sailed, I said. Thesivor tilted her head. Sailed, she repeated, and I could hear her matrix processing the idiom. Ah, yes. It is possible that particular ship is already in motion, but there is still value in navigation. Part 2, the weight of being seen. By the end of my first week on Velhadris, I had what Thesivor carefully referred to as an informal social calendar, which basically meant that every day, somewhere in my wandering around the station, I would encounter someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to speak with me. Sometimes it was planned. Thesavor would mention in the morning that a particular cultural specialist had submitted a meeting request, and she'd arranged a common area session. Sometimes it was spontaneous. I'd stop at one of the station's observation ports to watch the slow, enormous silence of deep space, and within about 7 minutes someone would materialize next to me. The observation ports were, I learned, becoming something of a gathering point. Apparently it had gotten around that I spent time there. My personal theory was that someone had started a communications thread about it. I was not wrong about that. I found out later that there was, in fact, a station-wide thread in the Valkyrie Cultural Exchange Network, which was something like a combination of a social platform and an academic forum, titled something that translated roughly as the Human, Ongoing Observations. It had over 2,000 participants. 2,000. The station's total resident and transient population was around 8,000 at any given time. I found out about the thread from a Valkyrie woman named Sar, who was one of the 12 formal meeting requests Thesavor had mentioned. Sar was a diplomatic cultural analyst. Her job was essentially to study how newly contacted species integrated into galactic social structures, and she had been assigned to Velhydris specifically for the period of my residency. She was direct in a way that I found immediately refreshing. No preamble, no apologetic hedging. She sat down across from me in the meeting room Thesavor had arranged, a small, comfortable space with adjustable atmospheric settings, currently running Earth Standard, which I was grateful for, and placed a flat display on the table between us. "I am going to show you something," she said, "that you may find either amusing or uncomfortable, possibly both. I am telling you this as a courtesy before I show it." "Go ahead," I said. She activated the display. The thread came up. 2,000 participants. A scrolling feed of observations, questions, analyzed clips from the station's shared camera systems, theoretical frameworks, and what appeared to be heated debate. "They're debating my paper journal," I said, reading as fast as I could. "There are 43 messages, just about my paper journal." "The act of writing by hand on a physical substrate," Sar confirmed, "has generated significant theoretical discussion. Several researchers have proposed that it indicates a human preference for irreversibility, that you choose a medium in which mistakes cannot be undone as a way of practicing deliberate decision-making." I looked up. "That's actually not a terrible theory. There are also 41 messages about your laugh, and a 17-message discussion about the specific way you looked out the observation port on day 5. There was apparent debate about whether the expression you displayed was melancholy, contemplation, or something. The thread participants are tentatively calling a third thing that they do not have a category for." "What did they conclude?" "That it requires more data," Sar said. She deactivated the thread. "I am showing you this not to alarm you, but because I believe transparency is foundational to productive exchange. You should know how you are being received. You should know that this level of attention is," she paused, "significant, even by the standards of this station. Thesavor told me it's been about 40 years since anything generated this much attention. Thesavor is correct in terms of frequency, but I would argue the quality is also different." She settled back slightly in her chair. "The last significant curiosity event here was diplomatic in nature, political. People were watching a situation. They were not," she searched for the word, "drawn, in the way they are drawn to you." I sat with that for a moment. "Why?" I asked. "Really, not the academic answer. What is it actually?" Sar looked at me for a long moment. She had a stillness to her that was different from Thesavor's, not oceanic but geological, like something that had been standing in one place for a very long time and had no particular interest in moving. "Honestly," she said. "Please." Because you are the first human that most of the species on this station have ever encountered directly. Not through reports, not through recordings, not through second-hand accounts. In person. And humans are you are, she stopped. Started again. The reports do not capture what it is like to be near one of you. I want to be careful about how I say this because I am aware it could be heard in ways I do not intend. But there is a quality to your presence, to your attention, to the way you experience the world and express that experience. It is more than the reports suggest. More how? She thought about this carefully. Most species, by the time they reach a certain level of civilizational development, have learned a degree of restraint, modulation. You learn to contain your emotional response to things. You learn to temper your reactions because strong reactions can be socially costly, politically costly. You learn to present a controlled surface. She looked at me. Humans have not learned this, or you have learned a version of it, but it is thin. The surface is controlled, but the depth is not. When you feel something, you feel it fully. And for some reason, perhaps the biochemistry, perhaps something else, it transmits. People feel it in the room with you. Even species that don't have strong empathic capability find themselves responding to your emotional state. And because most of us are accustomed to being around species who modulate, being around something that doesn't modulate is overwhelming. Remarkable, she corrected. Overwhelming would suggest it is negative. It is not negative. It is like standing near a heat source. When most of what you encounter runs at a lower temperature, a heat source feels extraordinary. You are drawn to it, even if you cannot fully explain why. Something shifted in my chest when she said that. Not discomfort. Something more like recognition. Like being handed a map of a place you'd been navigating blind. So it's not just curiosity about humans in general, I said. It's something about being near a human specifically. Yes, she said. The curiosity has been documented, theorized about, written about. But the experience of proximity was not something any of us were prepared for. The thread exists because people who have encountered you are trying to articulate something they had not previously had to articulate, something they did not have language for. I looked at the deactivated display. What about you? I asked. Is that what you're doing, trying to articulate something? She looked at me steadily. Yes, she said, among other things. The first real conflict happened at the end of week 2. I should note, for clarity, I'm using the word conflict loosely. Nobody got hurt, nothing exploded. By any reasonable measure, it was a minor incident. But it was the first time I understood that being the only human on the station wasn't just going to be about curiosity and interesting conversations. It was also going to be about the fact that the galactic community, for all its sophistication, had some fairly calcified assumptions about what humans were and were not capable of. And those assumptions sometimes ran up against the reality of standing in a room with an actual human. It happened in the station's main cultural exchange hall. This was a large, open space used for interspecies diplomatic and social events, lectures, exhibitions, trade showcases, that kind of thing. I'd been invited to attend a lecture series on galactic migration patterns, which was genuinely interesting to me, and also felt like a good way to spend an afternoon without generating the kind of focused attention I got when I was just walking around. The lecture hall could hold several hundred beings and was configured with adaptable seating, platforms, alcoves, and open floor areas that different species could arrange themselves in according to their comfort. I found a spot near the back that had something approximating a chair, a raised platform with a slight tilt that worked if you sat on it a certain way, and I settled in with my journal. About 20 minutes into the lecture, which was interesting enough that I was actually taking notes, a group of beings entered the hall and took up positions in the open floor area to my left. I noticed them peripherally. 5 of them, moving in a tight formation. Military posture, I recognized it across species lines. that particular quality of coordinated, deliberate movement that says we are a unit and we know it. They were from a species I hadn't yet encountered in person, the Galvath. Large, bilaterally symmetric, roughly humanoid in overall structure but significantly more massive, with dense gray-green exoskeletal plating over their outer limbs and torso. Their faces were flatter than a human face, with large horizontal visual slits instead of round eyes, and their mouths were wide and structured for different physics of speech than my translator was comfortable with. I got their meaning, but the audio was choppy, like the Matrix was working hard. What I noticed first was their posture. Not just the military formation that was expected, they were apparently a security delegation of some kind, passing through Velhydrus en route to somewhere. What I noticed was the way they were looking at things. The hall, the lecture, the other beings present. A cataloging look. The look of beings who assess. One of them looked at me. Stopped. Said something to the others. I caught fragments. My matrix flagged the word soft skin, ground-born earth creature, and then all 5 of them were looking at me. I went back to my notes. The lecture continued. I kept taking notes. I was aware, in the low-level background awareness way you develop when you've grown up hearing that certain things can go wrong, that the Galvath group was still looking at me periodically. But they hadn't approached me. They weren't doing anything. I did not immediately escalate this to a problem. After the lecture, when people were beginning to move toward the exits, one of the Galvath separated from the group and moved toward me. Not threatening in motion, deliberate, but not aggressive. He stopped at a distance that was slightly too far for casual conversation, which my translation briefing told me was a dominance-neutral positioning, asserting presence without entering personal space. You are the Earth creature, he said. My matrix rendered this as flat statement, no inflection. I'm a human, I said. From Earth, yeah. You are the one in residence on the station. 6-month cultural exchange program. He looked at me, not the cataloging look from before, something more direct, more assessing. I have read about your people, he said. I hope it was the good stuff, I said. No response to that. He continued. The reports say humans are capable under certain conditions. We try, I said. Under other conditions, he said, humans are fragile. Small, limited by the soft biology. I put my pen down, closed my journal, looked up at him fully. Okay, I said, where is this going? I am trying to understand the discrepancy, he said. The reports describe a species that is simultaneously surprisingly effective and structurally inadequate. I am trying to understand how both can be true. I thought about this for a moment. Walk with me, I said. He looked at me. Something shifted in his posture, surprise maybe. He had not expected me to invite engagement. Where, he said. Observation port. I was going anyway. We walked together to the nearest observation port, a long, curved viewing gallery on the station's outer ring, with a floor-to-ceiling composite window that showed unfiltered deep space. At this position in the station's orbit, you could see the edge of a nebula, enormous, slow, quietly luminous, the kind of thing that makes your brain try to understand distances it wasn't built for. He stood next to me at the window. He was almost twice my height. In my peripheral vision, his silhouette was vast. We looked at space for a moment. The discrepancy, I said, exists because the reports are taking a snapshot. They're measuring humans in specific conditions and applying those measurements universally. It doesn't work that way. Explain, he said. Okay, I'm small. Compared to you, I'm very small. My skeleton is less dense than yours. My skin doesn't have protective plating. My sensory range is genuinely limited. I can't see much of the electromagnetic spectrum. My hearing cuts out on both ends. My sense of smell is basically decorative compared to most species. I paused. All of that is true. Then the limitation assessment is accurate. In isolation, sure, but here's the part that doesn't make it into the reports because it's hard to quantify. I turned and looked at him directly. We know we're limited. We've always known. We didn't evolve in a stable, protected environment. We evolved in a world that was actively trying to kill us, competing against things bigger than us, faster than us, stronger than us, for millions of years, and we survived anyway. He said nothing. We survived by being adaptive, I said, by being creative, by figuring out how to extend our capability through tools, through cooperation, through stubbornness that probably looked insane from the outside. We don't have your plating, so we made armor. We can't run as fast as the things that hunted us, so we developed the capacity to track and pursue over distances that exhausted our prey. We're not individually as strong, so we figured out how to coordinate groups that could outperform the strongest individual. I looked back at the nebula. The limitation is real, but the response to the limitation is also real, and the response is adaptive in ways that are hard to predict. Silence. The reports, he said slowly, focus on the limitation. Because the limitation is easy to measure, I said, the adaptation is harder. More silence. He was looking at the nebula now too. Your people were hunted, he said, for most of our history. And now? I let that question hang in the air for a moment. Now we're standing on an alien space station, I said, watching a nebula, 8 years after being cleared for galactic access, 400 years after your people first started building infrastructure out here. I looked at him. Draw your own conclusion. He was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, I owe you a reassessment. You don't owe me anything, I said, but if you're genuinely curious, I'm around for 6 months. He turned to look at me. The horizontal visual slits of his eyes were wide, wider than they'd been before, something that my matrix, after a moment of processing, flagged as recalibrated respect. I am Grav Commander Dawson, he said, Galvath Defense Cohort 3rd Fleet. Kai Mercer, I said, human first trip to space. Something happened in his posture, a very slight shift. My matrix rendered it after a moment as startled, recalibrating further. This is your first time in galactic space, he said. Yep. He looked at the nebula, then back at me, then at the nebula again. And you stand here, he said, looking at that with that expression on your face that my cultural matrix is identifying as he paused. Quiet wonder. Yeah, I said, it's pretty incredible. Rather than the fear response that we typically observe in first-time galactic space travelers. I mean, I'm aware it's enormous, I said. I'm aware I'm a very small thing looking at a very big thing, but that's not frightening to me. That's the point. That's why you come. He was quiet for a very long time after that. When he left, about 20 minutes later, he inclined his head in what my cultural briefing identified as a formal Galvath acknowledgement of significant respect, the kind usually reserved for beings of significantly higher rank. I wrote about it that night in my journal. I wrote, he expected me to be afraid of the size of things. I think a lot of them expect that. They don't understand that where I come from, we learned a long time ago that being afraid of the size of things doesn't make the things smaller. It just makes the time shorter.